Good evening, everybody. I'm Paul Harrison, and on behalf of the Ho Center for Buddhist Studies at Stanford and our co-sponsor, the Stanford Humanities Center, I'd like to welcome you to the 11th Shin-Yo-en Visiting Professor Lecture. It is a rare pleasure for me to be able to introduce a fellow New Zealander. It is in fact quite unusual for two New Zealand Buddhologists to be occupying the same space-time continuum. It's not quite so marvelous as Shakyamuni and Prabhuta in the Lotus Sutra, but it's edging in that direction. Professor Michael Radich was initially trained at the University of Auckland, my own alma mater, where he took a bachelor's degree in music and an MA in Chinese studies in the same department in which I also studied some years previous to that. After that, our paths diverge. He proceeded to Harvard University, where in 2007 he completed his PhD in East Asian Languages and Civilizations. He taught for over a decade in the Religious Studies program at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand, until the beginning of 2018, when he answered the call to a chair in Buddhist Studies at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. He has also held visiting positions at the University of Hamburg and at Kyoto University. Professor Radich is a specialist in Buddhist history, literature and thought, both in India and in China. He is particularly active in research into the reception of Indian Buddhism in the Middle Kingdom and what that tells us about the Buddhist tradition in both countries. Drawing on materials in Sanskrit, Pali, Chinese and Tibetan, he has written, among other things, various important papers on the work of the 6th century translator Paramartha, and he has also worked on the output of several other translators. Currently, Dhammaraksha, late 3rd, early 4th century, is occupying much of his attention. In pursuing this research, Professor Radich has been especially energetic in pioneering new computer-based approaches to working out problems of authorship and attribution for Chinese Buddhist translations, and his online database of canonical inscriptions is a major contribution to our field. Among Professor Radich's books is a study of traditions about the famous parasite king Ajatashatru, which go up to the development in the field of psychology in Japan in the 20th century of the so-called Ajatashatru complex, the Ajase complexu, as an Asian counterpart to the well-known Oedipus complex. He has also published a richly detailed study of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, as we used to call it, and the emergence of Tathagata doctrine. And that brings us to the topic of his lecture this evening, the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra in the religion of 6th century China, as glimpsed through Sengchou's cave at Xiaonanhai. The choice of this topic is particularly appropriate for two reasons. First, the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra is the principal scriptural authority for the form of Japanese Buddhism represented by Shin-Yo-en, whose generosity provided the endowment at Stanford, which has for the last decade funded the Shin-Yo-en Visiting Professorship, which has brought Professor Radich to Stanford. Each visiting professor has given a lecture, and this is the 11th in the series. I would like, therefore, to take this opportunity to thank the Shin-Yo-en Foundation for making all this possible and to acknowledge the presence in the audience of the Reverend Shohei Nakamura and other guests from Shin-Yo-en. Thank you very much to you and to Shin-Yo-en for all the support, encouragement and vision you have provided and continue to provide to the Buddhist Studies program at Stanford. In the second place, the choice of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-sūtra is especially apt because it is believed to be, or at least incorporate, the last teachings delivered by the Buddha before his death, the circumstances of which it recounts. It was, in effect, the Buddha's very last lecture. While tonight's lecture is hopefully not Professor Radich's swan song, it does happen to be the last Shin-Yo-en Visiting Professor lecture, since Professor Radich is the final occupant of the position. We are in fact 4 days away from the 10th anniversary of the first of these lectures, which was delivered by Professor John McRae still much lamented in the field, on April the 22nd, 2009. We have had a distinguished line of speakers, and now their watch has ended. The visiting professorship will be no more, but thanks once again to the kindness of Xin Yuan, it has been transformed into a permanent tenured faculty post supported by the now renamed Shinso Ito Professorship Fund. A search for the first occupant of this position is currently in its final stages, and we hope to announce the name of the successful candidate soon. This is an evening then where the theme of endings looms large, but endings often lead to beginnings and to new possibilities. With that in mind, I will stop talking and call on Professor Radich to begin his lecture, and I invite you to join me in welcoming him. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, Paul, for that very generous introduction. It's a special honour for me to be introduced by you as well, not only because you're a New Zealander, but because you are, to use your own word from the weekend, one of the giants in the field, and it's an honour to be here speaking before you. I would also like to thank everybody else for coming. I would like to express some regret that Paul has set up a comparison between my lecture and the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, because I think that there's no way I can possibly live up to those expectations, but I will do my best. It's a great honour to be giving this lecture and to hold this visiting professorship. Although I think, looking at the list of prior incumbents of the position, that I am the absolute baby of the group. I would also like to take this chance to voice a few words of thanks. I'm grateful to Paul Harrison, to John Kieschnick, Irene Lin and their staff for hosting me and making practical arrangements to ensure that my wife Amanda and I could walk off a plane and slip very easily into a comfortable California life. I'm also very grateful to the Xin Yuan Foundation for their generous support, which makes it all possible. And finally, I would like to thank the students who are attending my classes and already teaching me a great deal. At about this time in any lecture outside New Zealand, I normally apologise for the aberrant species of English that I speak. But on this occasion, I'm in a very awkward position because it's the same kind spoken by Paul. So I'll just say that I hope you can all understand everything I say. Tonight, I want to talk to you about a cave in Henan. I will try to persuade you that although it is small, this cave can teach us new things about an early phase in the history of meditation in China, and also about the way that we should read such sites and about general themes in the Buddhism of its time. The cave in question is found at Xiaonanhai in northern Henan. Paul gave you a little preview of some of my slides, but here's the second one. And I think for this next bit, I'll step out. I hope that you can still hear me if I move away from the microphone. So here's Henan in the northeast of China, the red province on the map over there to the right. And then here is Anyang County, which is on the northern edge of the province, which is the place where we found Xiaonanhai. It's about 500 kilometers south and slightly west of Beijing. Here in Anyang County is an indication of approximately where the cave sits. And then finally, this map of the immediate area shows that there are a couple of other interesting sites in the vicinity. So here we have Xiangtangshan, and here we have Lingquansi, both of which also have interesting Buddhist caves. The cave that I will talk about tonight was rediscovered and excavated in 1983, and the first publications upon it appeared in 1988. At that time it was several meters high up a sheer cliff face, and it was quite difficult to access, I would imagine. But a few years later, a quarry nearby threatened to destabilize it, and so the entire cave was cut out of the cliff face and moved down onto the level ground in front of it. These days then, it looks like this. So far as I know, the exact process by which it was moved is not known to scholarship, and unfortunately I myself have not been there, so I haven't had a chance to ask any locals. So first of all, let's do a quick tour of the cave, a tiki tour, as we say in New Zealand. On the front outside wall, as you can see here, there's a considerable amount of text carved into the stone. This is a detail that allows you to get a quick glimpse of the calligraphy. And here then is a map of the front wall. In area number 1, up in the top right, there is a donor's inscription, which then carries through to areas number 5 to the top right of the door and 6 to the bottom right. Area number 2, above the door on the left, contains some hymns from the Buddhavatamsaka or Huayanjing, the plethora of Buddhas or copious array of Buddhas. Area 3, which is the largest area, contains an extended passage from the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. And area 4, finally to the far left, contains verses from elsewhere in the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra relating to King Ajatashatru. Area 7, down at the bottom by the door, just says, mindfully recall the Buddhas, mindfully recall the Dharma, mindfully recall the Sangha, Nian Fo, Nian Fa, Nian Seng. On the inside, the cave looks roughly like this. So it's quite small, about 1.4 meters by 1.7, and apparently not quite tall enough for an adult to stand up straight. So I imagine it as being about the same size as one of those extruded plastic single-piece Japanese bathrooms that you find in a business hotel. And it would be impossible for me to lie straight in any given direction in the cave because I'm too tall. So we'll just go quickly around to give you an idea of the overall program, and we'll move clockwise through the cave. And this is where I'm not sure how I'm going to manage the slides and the pointing. But beginning on the east wall, over the far side, at numbers 1 to 3, that wall is divided into an upper half and a lower half. On the lower half, there is an iconic triad of a Buddha and a pair of bodhisattvas. Between some of these figures, there is a hermit, a rishi, called Vasu, and he is the right-hand figure in this picture. We'll come back to the other one in a minute. On the upper half, we have reliefs. To the right, Shakyamuni teaching or turning the wheel of the Dharma in Deer Park, and on the left, Maitreya preaching in Tushta Heaven. This is a more detailed representation of the Maitreya portion along with a photo of the same, but it's not very clear. So then moving along to the back wall, which is numbers 4 to 6 up at the top there, as I mentioned already, in the center there is a Buddha image, and to its right, which is number 4 on my diagram here, there is an image of Sengchou, to whom we will soon return. There is also a relief which shows a scene from a Jataka, and then to our left, to the Buddha's proper right, there is another Jataka scene. This is a rubbing of the same wall, which shows some of the relief in more detail. And then here we can see in the sketch an even better view, which kind of makes the outlines of the drawings or the representations clearer. Okay, so then moving along to, oh, here we are, there's some photos. This is a moment I'll anticipate. So this figure here, diving head downward, is a bodhisattva who is attempting to commit suicide. We'll come back to that. So remember that little moment. So then moving on to the west wall, which is on the left-hand side of the image from numbers 7 to 9. This wall too is divided into 2 halves. Below we have another iconic triad, and then on the upper half, there we go, I've got some slides backwards. There is a relief of the 9 degrees of rebirth in Amitabha's Pure Land, and then the triad again has one of these figures, and this time it's the Brahman Mrigashiras. And this is just some detail of the Amitabha Pure Land relief that's on the top half. So then the very final element on the inside of the cave is this. If you walked into the cave, this would be above you but behind, above the door. And this is a relief of the scene in which the goddess appears in the Vimalakirti Nirdesha and the debate between Manjusri and Vimalakirti, which is, as luck would have it, the very scene that we are reading in our class. Okay, so tonight my interpretation is going to focus on material that derives from the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra and one other related element from another text. So that means that we're going to be looking at the long inscription on the front wall, the 2 Jataka reliefs inside on either side of the Buddha, the verses that relate to Ajatashatru, and a couple of other very small elements. But before we move on to all of that, I would like first to locate the cave in history. So as I said, on the front wall there is a dedicatory inscription. The inscription locates the cave very precisely in time and connects it with an interesting historical figure. Carving began in the year 550 and was initially sponsored by an association of lay donors, as was very common especially in North China at this time. In 555, however, new funds were furnished by a famous monk called Sengchou. And in fact, at this point on the inscription we can see his name, so we know for sure that it was him. The exciting thing is that we know about Sengchou from transmitted historical sources as well, so we were able to put pieces together from two different locations. It appears that it was only when Sengchou got involved that the carvers began adding text to the cave. And then Sengchou died 5 years later in 560. At that point, I guess, his disciples had a text carved on a meditation that he favoured. And they say in the dedicatory inscription that they did this in order that his meditation not be forgotten, ironically enough, as I'll mention soon. This is the longest text on the cave, which is number 3 in my diagram of the front wall, and we'll spend quite a bit of time on that momentarily. Somewhere on the line, somebody also added an image of Sengchou himself as the principal donor on one of the interior cave walls, as I mentioned, at number 4 in the interior, and here he is, Sengchou, 1500 years later nearly. So who was Sengchou? He was one of the most famous monks in 6th century China under the Northern Qi dynasty, the Beiqi. He was especially renowned for his meditation practice. In a famous anecdote, he is praised by somebody probably called Bhadra as the foremost exponent of so-called Chan Xue Zhizui, east of the Pamir Mountains. Works in Dunhuang manuscripts which are ascribed to him, although questionably, also focus on so-called Chan. For most of his life he was a recluse, but in 551 he was persuaded to come to the capital, Ye, where he became a spiritual advisor to the Northern Qi Emperor Wenxuan and taught him the meditation for which he was so famous. He ended his life, as a result of these moves, as one of the most influential monks alive. So let us begin our examination of the texts at this cave by seeing what they can add to our understanding of the history of meditation. Sengchou's meditation is referred to as Chan, and posterity perceived him as an expositor of Chan. Sengchou's practice has therefore been studied as part of the prehistory of the eventual so-called Chan schools. That's the same word that later becomes Zen in Japanese and even in English. However, in my view, prior scholarship has usually misinterpreted Sengchou's most likely practice by using the wrong sources to guess what it was like. The texts carved at the cave help guide us to more accurate interpretations. Now, in the interests of fairness, I should note that there were at least 2 scholars before me who did basically advance accurate interpretations of Sengchou's practice. And they were the late John McCrae, who's already been mentioned once this night, one of my illustrious predecessors in this series, and Christoph Andel. Both of these scholars achieved this feat without reference to the cave. In McCrae's case, in fact, working before the cave was even rediscovered. And this connection is only one reason why it's a special pleasure to have Jan Nattier here this evening. So the problems that plagued prior work on Sengchou's meditation, I think, can be divided into 2 groups. The first group of problems arise from reliance on the aforementioned dubious Dunhuang manuscripts, and I think we can just set those aside. The second group of problems arose when scholars were misled by the name of the meditation and bypassed its actual textual source to interpret it on the basis of more remote texts and stereotypical understandings. Even in our transmitted historical sources, Sengchou's meditation was named. It is called the 4 bases of mindfulness, the Sengchou, or in Sanskrit, the Chattari Smrityupasthanani. Historical sources also state that Sengchou drew this meditation from the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. Biographical anecdotes, furthermore, say that Sengchou broke through a key obstacle to progress in his own practice earlier in his life through practice of exactly this meditation, the same meditation that he then went on to teach to the emperor when he was called to the capital. Finally, and perhaps this by now comes as no surprise, this is the meditation that is carved at the cave, that is our longest textual passage here. prior scholars tripped up when they ignored the key point that Sengchou's 4 bases of mindfulness meditation was based upon the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. A meditation of the same name, of course, is extremely famous and basic, and it is known from mainstream canonical sources like the Mahāsatipatthana Sutta and its parallels. The trouble is that the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra is, on this point as on many things, a very peculiar text, and this is one of the reasons that I have found myself obsessed by it. In its account of this meditation, as in many other things, it deviates greatly from other canonical sources. Prior scholars then said, oh, the 4 bases of mindfulness, right. And so then they characterized Sengchou's supposed meditation on the basis of texts like the Mahāsatipatthana or even dictionaries. And this meant that they gave descriptions that had next to nothing to do with Sengchou's actual practice. So here, as a point of comparison, is the same practice as it is in fact laid out in the Mahāsatipatthana. As the name indicates, this meditation has 4 parts. It lays out 4 bases of mindfulness, or topics, each of which then breaks down further. First, moving through the slide, excuse me. So first one contemplates body in the body, or possibly body as the body, which seems to mean that you focus deliberately and exclusively on a series of bodily activities, including breathing, basic postures, and quotidian movements, and then on the various parts of the body, emphasizing its disgusting, impermanent, and corruptible nature. Second, one moves the focus to feelings as they arise and pass away. Third, one focuses on states of mind, which seems to mean mostly emotions. And then fourth, one focuses on objects of mind, which entails working through a long list of Buddhist doctrinal categories. At each stage, the practitioner is repeatedly instructed to cultivate a kind of distance and repose with regard to these objects. One should be ardent, clearly aware and mindful, put aside worldly hankering and fretting, and remain independent, not clinging to worldly things. The meditation that Sengchou found in the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra is very different, although it does share some motifs. First, one meditates on the disgusting impurity of a list of body parts, observing that no self is to be found in each. Next, one mentally strips the flesh off one's bones and meditates upon the white bones that are thus exposed, observing them as they imaginatively progress through a series of 4 colours as they rot. Third, we get what I like to call the dem bones meditation, because it's somewhat like the spiritual, the foot bones connected to the leg bone to the ankle bone, and so on. Now hear the word of the Lord. That is to say, you have to think that each bone from the foot up to the head is dependent upon the last. The ankle bone depends upon the foot bone, and so on. Then, in the 4th phase, one meditates upon a vision of the entire world, suffused by the same 4 colours as the rotting bones. 5th, beams of light emanate from the point between the eyebrows, and images of Buddhas appear in the rays of light. Next, however, the text scripts a doubt. The meditator thinks roughly, if this is what my body is like, how can it possibly move or act? And suddenly the Buddhas disappear. The meditator then thinks that perhaps consciousness or breath might be a self, but realizes that neither of these notions can be right. Then at numbers 9 and 10 on the slide, one realizes that there is no self in the body. And this is key. This then means that it's possible to tolerate insults, abuse, and even physical torture. That is to say, one can exercise the virtue or perfection of kshanti, which is the patient tolerance of adversity, so important in classical schemes of the 6 or alternatively 10 perfections on the bodhisattva path. This is fortunate because according to the next scripted thought, without kshanti, one would act badly and fall into evil destinies. In other words, the practice of this meditation culminates in the acquisition of a difficult virtue which is vital for the bodhisattva vocation. And indeed, the passage ends by stating, in a manner generally echoing maps of the bodhisattva path, that this culminating achievement is called the stage or ground of patient endurance, the kshanti bhumi. Well, it is difficult even to list fully all of the ways that this meditation deviates from the classical Mahasatipatthana model. Although the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra version is called the Four Bases of Mindfulness, in classical terms it only covers one of the so-called bases, the body or kaya gatanusmrti. Even here, key elements are missing, and the meagre elements that are shared appear in a different order. The meditation on the white bones and the technicolor transformation of the bones as they rot is new and quite elaborate and unparalleled in any mainstream canonical text on similar meditations. There are also new morals to the story. The realization of non-self with regard to the body, what we might call an antidote to satkaya drishti, and the attainment of kshanti. The moment where consciousness is taken as an object of meditation is particularly interesting and unparalleled in mainstream versions of related meditations. The way that the meditation now relates to the bodhisattva path may also indicate a partial Mahayana colouring, which is also new. And in that light, it is also interesting to note that when we look beyond this specific passage in the broader context in the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, where this passage is located, we can find only at best defective vestiges of a path model, and what we find does not map onto path models that are known from other better known sources. In short then, close analysis of the actual textual source shows that in many respects, Sengchou's actual so-called Four Bases of Mindfulness meditation was very different from the picture painted by much prior scholarship. The central place given to this passage at the cave confirms that we must rely upon the details of this passage rather than stereotypical generalizations if we are to gain an accurate view of the practice that brought Sengchou his fame. Beyond this, however, I think that certain thematic dimensions of the meditation can be drawn out more clearly when we interpret this passage in coordination with other elements of the program of the cave, mostly also from the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. In this respect, I think that it is possible to go even beyond rare scholars like McRae and Undell, who at least based their understanding upon the actual source. In order to convey to you this next part of my analysis, though, I need first to describe and contextualize other textual elements at the cave and related visual elements. To anticipate, here too, I think it is possible to go beyond prior scholarship, but for different reasons. Prior scholars of the program of the cave as a whole, usually art historians, have tended to stop at identifying and interpreting source passages as single units and in isolation from one another. I want to try and show that the various references to the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra work in concert, and that our interpretation gains depth when we interpret them and the passages that they allude to in various contexts at a range of scales. So we have to go back inside the cave now. In my case, I have to duck to get through the doorway, to numbers 4 and 6 on the back wall on either side of the central Buddha. As I mentioned, there are Jataka reliefs on either side of that central image, and the textual sources of these reliefs can be identified very precisely by text in cartouches. So in this sketch by Inamoto, you can see the cartouches very clearly. In the rubbing, I find it quite hard to even pick exactly where they are. But the relief that's on the left comes from the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. The one that's on the right comes from the Mahaprajñāparamitopadesha, or Dājidulun, a massive commentary on the larger Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. This text was translated by Kumarajiva only 2 or 3 decades before the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra itself, and that means that both texts were introduced into Chinese a little over a century before the cave was carved. So let's begin on the left with the Jataka from the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. The scene is a past lifetime in which the Bodhisattva was a Brahmin. It is important to note that the Brahmin Bodhisattva is living in the mountains and practicing meditation. He is also pursuing a quest for Mahayana Sutras. The gods look down and, impressed by the strength of his ascetic practice, they speechify about his willingness to give up everything, including life and limb, for the truth. Indeed, they speculate that he may be a Buddha in the making. However, Shakra, the Lord of the Gods, doubts the Bodhisattva's mettle and decides to test him. He transforms himself into a terrifying, bloodthirsty Rakshasa. This is a kind of ogre of some sort. Descends into the mountains and recites the first half of a verse which epitomizes the Dharma. This is the verse which is featured in the cartouches on the left-hand side. The Bodhisattva is inspired and requests clarification of the meaning of these words. Shakra, however, still disguised as a Rakshasa, says that he is really hungry, but he hasn't been able to find food anywhere for a very long time, and so he offers a terrible bargain. He will gladly recite the other half of the verse only if the Bodhisattva agrees to let him eat him. The Bodhisattva thinks that this is a good deal and says that by giving up his present body, and giving up here is sha in Chinese, a word that we will return to, he will obtain an adamantine body, a Jinggangshan or a Vajrakaya. The Shakra Rakshasa, true to his word, then recites the other half of the verse, and then it is important for us to note the next thing that the Bodhisattva Brahman does. He writes the verse everywhere, on rocks, cliffs, trees, and the road. Then, true to his word, he attempts to kill himself by jumping from a tree. This is the bit that I pointed out earlier. And so you can see him at the top there, plummeting down. And at the very last second, Shakra changes back to his true form, catches him in midair, and deposits him gently and safely on the earth. Shakra then changes back to his true form, declares himself satisfied that the Bodhisattva has passed the test and truly has the right stuff to attain Anuttara Samyak Sambodhi. So, what was the verse for which the Bodhisattva was willing to face such a gruesome death? It's not just any verse, and it's right there on the wall. Here it is. In terms of its content, this verse is an epitome of the entire Dharma, saying that all things are impermanent. At the first level, the verse helps us to identify the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra as the exact source of the particular version of the Jataka that we are engaging with. That is to say, there are many other versions of the same Jataka, but the verse that Indra or Shakra recites when he comes down differs, and it is only in this version that this is the verse in question. Secondly, however, this is a quote within a quote. More remotely, this same verse is associated in multiple texts with the moment of the Buddha's parinirvāna, or his final death. In one version, the verse is recited by the Buddha himself, and in another, by none other than Shakra. So we have these kind of wheels within wheels. It's quite an amazing little nested structure. No informed medieval Chinese Buddhist, I argue, would have failed to notice all of these references. And this means that the Bodhisattva was willing to die precisely for a teaching about the Buddha's parinirvāna and its significance. And this means that the verse is one of our first signs at the cave of a theme which runs through other material there as well, the cult of the Dharma, specifically referring to the cult of the text in relation to the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra itself. So let's turn next for the moment to the opposite Jataka relief and verse, which is on the right from the Mahaprajñapāramitōpadesha. Here is the verse that allows us, from the cartouche again, that allows us to identify that story and its source. This verse, don't get bogged down reading it please, especially the philologists in the room, basically says there's nothing as awesome as a Buddha. The two Buddhas, the two Bodhisattvas, Shakyamuni and Maitreya, at this point in their careers, are living during the time of the past Buddha Pushya. Pushya wants to test the purity of Shakyamuni's mind. We should note again that in order to do so, he enters into a jeweled cave. There, he enters into the samadhi of the element of fire, the Tejo Dhatu Samadhi, and emanates a great light. When Shakyamuni sees him in this cave, emanating this light like this, he is so inspired and overawed that he stands stock still before him for 7 days and nights on end, without batting an eyelid, contemplating Pushya single-mindedly, Ishinarkwan, and reciting over and over again a verse of praise, which is exactly the verse in the cartouche, this verse. Now, in the Mahaprajñapāramitōpadesha, this Jataka is used to introduce a much longer section of the text. The overall context is a version of the Buddha's extended biography, to borrow John Strong's phrase, for the epic spanning multiple lifetimes that traces the Bodhisattva's entire career. In this context, the text explains that after this first encounter with Pushya, Shakyamuni subsequently reached full and perfect awakening faster than Maitreya because he was more dedicated to the well-being of other sentient beings, whereas Maitreya was more focused on his own benefit. The text then explains how Shakyamuni achieved this. He cultivated the 6 perfections, paramita, and thereby acquired the body which is replete with the 32 marks of the Mahāpurusha. If anyone's not familiar with this refers to an old tradition that when a bodhisattva is reborn in his last lifetime, he has certain physiognomic marks on his body which are visible to those who have the third eye, and these marks characterize to only 2 kinds of beings, a Buddha or a Chakravarti Raja, a wheel-turning emperor of the entire world. So the bodhisattva is depicted as having a choice between these 2 destinies. But these bodily marks include things like the 40 teeth, which are exactly the same size and shape and have no gaps between them, and the body hair that curls to the right, and the fleshy protuberance on the top of the head, and so on. And all of these things are meant to indicate that he has this special nature. These marks are then explained as the rewards for countless lifetimes of practice of the perfections in certain parts of the later tradition. So Shakyamuni in this Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra telling earned this body, which then made him an advanced bodhisattva and subsequently a Buddha, precisely through his practice of these perfections in various bodhisattva lifetimes. And the text recounts various jatakas illustrating the way that he practiced these perfections. 2 are particularly relevant to the themes of the cave. The first is the Shibi Jataka, which is retold at some length, which is a story of a king who gave his own flesh to save the life of a dove, illustrating the perfection supposedly of generosity or charity, dana paramita, and specifically the donation of one's own body, deha dana, which in Chinese again is shashan, giving up the body. The second is the Jataka of Kshantivadin, who bore the systematic piecewise slicing up of his own body with equanimity, which is said to illustrate the perfection of patient endurance, the Kshanti Paramita. But both have this common theme that one is prepared to undergo physical suffering, regardless of which perfection it is nominally associated with. So the implicit logic of the larger Prajñā Paramitopadesha context alluded to here seems to be this. Shakyamuni was inspired by the sight of the glorious body of Pushya Buddha as expressed in his 7 days of adoration and recitation. Powered by this inspiration, he practiced the perfection for eons with a notable emphasis upon the abandonment of the ordinary body. And through this practice, he himself acquired just such a perfect body, distinguished by the 32 marks of the Mahāpurusha, which are built precisely through the perfections. I just suggested that the other Jataka on giving up the body for a single verse evokes the theme of the cult of the Dharma. I think it is meaningful to note a symmetry whereby the opposing Jataka, the one that I've just characterized, on seeing the glorious Buddha in a cave, evokes a theme of the cult of the Buddha or the Buddhas. The parallel modalities of these 2 cults of Dharma and Buddha respectively, I think, are fundamental to the religiosity that is reflected in the cave. It's a stereophonic religiosity that comes to you in 2 channels. It is important to note that both are precisely cultic, that is to say they revolve around practice and more specifically around worship and offerings. So an aspect of this theme is further reinforced by more text from the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, which is carved at the cave. One of the verses which is quoted in the dedicatory inscription. So here we're at number 6 down in the bottom right-hand corner. We're out on the front wall again. That's the first of the 2 verses that you see here, which celebrates the nirvana of the Tathagata. This verse also comes within the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra from a Jataka. In this case, the Buddha states that in the remote past, he heard that there was an opportunity to hear the selfsame Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, but he was too poor to scrape together even a minimal offering that would allow him to hear it. Luckily for him, a certain man had a disease, and a doctor had prescribed a dose of human flesh each day. So the Bodhisattva entered into the patient's employ and each day he cut off some of his own flesh to supply the patient's need in exchange for a fee of 5 gold karshapana. Then he used this money as an offering in exchange for hearing the Dharma. He was only able to remember this single verse, but he still thought that he had the better part of the bargain. He carried on like this every day for a month. He felt no pain whenever he cut his flesh. The patient was fully cured, and the Bodhisattva's body fully recovered each time he cut his own flesh off. The Buddha further asserts that it was only thanks to this single gatha that he was able to ultimately become a Buddha himself. So here then, the cult of the Dharma is really forcefully promoted, again with specific reference to the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra itself. And indeed, this is another point where I think we need to zoom out to broader context. The Jataka is embedded in a longer sequence modelling that cult, the cult of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, and laying out its benefits. For example, a Bodhisattva Mahasattva who wishes to attain the unsurpassed amrita or ambrosia of the fruit of Buddhahood copies the sutra in writing, memorizes it, recites it, and expounds it for others. Like a charm which renders one immune to snakebite for 7 years, a single hearing of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra renders one immune to rebirth in the 3 bad destinies for 7 kalpas. It guarantees anuttara samyak sambodhi, full, perfect and unsurpassed awakening, and allows one to see Buddha nature, like a Chakravarti Raja or wheel-turning emperor who attains ambrosia. Anyone who copies the text in this manner will ensure that the Buddha himself will always dwell where he dwells, however humble he or his dwelling might be. Excuse me. So I hope that you're beginning to see that the various references to the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra at the cave reinforce one another and add up to a whole which is greater than the sum of the parts. The same is true of the second verse that we see here. This verse is also quoted in the same donor's inscription and occurs twice in quick succession in the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. It resonates on multiple levels. First, as you can see, the context is about physical violence to the body, the same concern which featured at the climax of Sengchou's meditation. And in fact, one instance of the verse is followed by another passage saying that some special bhikshus and arhats do not feel fear when they are attacked. So this thematizes fortitude in the face of pain, which is also focused upon in Sengchou's meditation. Second, within the vast Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, the locus at which this verse occurs is pivotal for 2 reasons. It occurs, first of all, just before the dramatic scene, which should be the entire raison d'être of the text, in which the Buddha lies down as if to die. And I don't have time to go into this, but a plot spoiler if you haven't read the Mahayana version of the text. The text is called basically the death of the Buddha, and the Buddha does not die, which is really quite weird, I think. So like the verse we saw earlier saying that all things are impermanent, this verse too evokes that moment, the problematic of the Buddha's parinirvāna as a whole. But the verse also occurs in close association with the figure of King Ajatashatru. The Buddha says that he spoke this verse for the sake of Ajatashatru. And the association with Ajatashatru ties the verse to another strand in the program of the cave to which we will soon return. Even all of this, though, is not all for this one tiny verse, because this verse too is a quote within a quote. It comes this time from the Dhammapada, the verses on the teaching. In the Dhammapada, it's part of a whole sequence of verses on the theme of violence to the person and the moral duty to refrain from violence to others. So again, for knowledgeable audiences, all of these echoes would have meant that this single verse activated a whole complex of knowledge, thematizing the problem of bodily violence and escape from it. So to complete our survey of references to the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra at the cave, let us turn to a last set of verses which are quoted in the donative inscription here at number 4 on the far left. Let's not get bogged down in reading these verses too closely. I will try and give you the gist for my purposes. Within the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, these verses are enunciated by the same King Ajatashatru at the very moment when he rejoices in his salvation. The background to this moment is rich. Ajatashatru killed his father in order to usurp his throne. He thus became, in the Buddhist tradition, one of a few most notorious wrongdoers, and his case was used to work out problems about the nature, power, and extent of the redemption that is possible through Buddhist means. The Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra version of his story is, again, unusual. It proposes that even though Ajatashatru's crimes were so heinous, he is completely redeemed, again, through the power of the Buddha, and most importantly, through seeing the Buddha, and also through the power of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra itself. So let us just note a few of the most relevant themes in these verses that Ajatashatru sings at the moment he is redeemed. He emphasizes his good fortune in seeing the Buddha. He underlines the merit that comes from serving the three jewels and speaks of transferring the merit of seeing the Buddha and serving the three jewels to the achievement of unsurpassed awakening, that is to say, the attainment of the final goal of the Bodhisattva path. He also wishes that all sentient beings may likewise conceive of an aspiration to full awakening and embark upon the Bodhisattva path themselves. Finally, he expects that sentient beings will traverse that path by the practice of buddhanusmriti, that is, mindful recollection of the Buddhas in all of their visual glory. This brings us to the end of our whirlwind tour of some of the elements at the cave, especially the parts that come from the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. Please bear in mind that the cave is even richer, especially if we consider all of its visual elements. Time and lack of expertise prevent me from proposing to you a full interpretation of the entire program. I do hope, however, that what we have seen today is sufficient to allow me to zoom out and make several broader points in conclusion. First, I already suggested that the various elements at the cave work in concert with one another. I also suggested that we could identify further dimensions of Sengchou's so-called 4 bases of mindfulness meditation in light of its relations to other parts of that program. Let me try to briefly summarize the complex of motifs I see at work here and how they cohere around a particular understanding of embodied bodhisattva practice. Several key themes recur through the textual elements that we have surveyed. The framework is the bodhisattva vocation. The ordinary body is disgusting, impure, and worthless. The bodhisattva must be willing to give up that body in pursuit of his goal. Numerous references to jatakas, both direct and indirect, conjure up past paragons who successfully met this challenge. The so-called 4 bases of mindfulness meditation shows how to give it up through the realization of the perfection of patient endurance, or kshanti, and through the realization of the absence of self, or atman, which is a major impediment. Another major impediment might be defilements or bad karma, but the drama of Ajatashatru in particular shows that this impediment too can be overcome through a correct cultic relationship to the Buddha. Further, this is only one of many points at which the pursuit of the bodhisattva path is depicted as achieved through cultic practice. Other elements stress that an effective cultic relation to the Buddha or Buddhas is predominantly visual and even involves specifically seeing the Buddha in caves. Glorious visions of wondrous Buddha bodies are pursued in part because they represent the goals and rewards of the bodhisattva path. That is to say, the end of that path is in significant part the attainment of just such a glorious body to replace the worthless body that one so dramatically left behind. Paralleling the cult of the Buddhas, the cult of the Dharma is equally strongly emphasized. But this cult of the Dharma is here not merely generic or diffuse, but is focused sharply on its instantiation in one particular text, the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra itself. Zooming out still further, these themes resonate with several identifiable strands strong in the Buddhism of Sengchou's age. These are not necessarily the same elements emphasized in the work of prior scholars on the cave. First, for example, the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra was not only central to this one cave. The text arguably had a greater impact on medieval Chinese Buddhist culture than any other single text. Evidence includes the profound influence that was exercised by the Tathagata Garbha doctrine, especially under the name of Buddha nature or Forxing, controversies over the Iccantaka, representations of the parinirvāna in art and visual culture, the massive scholastic energy that was poured into commentaries and lectures on the text, especially in the 5th through early 6th centuries, even through to the early 7th, the probable composition in China of several new scriptures which in various ways were indebted to this text, the number of manuscripts that have survived from the text, and the massive representation of this text in the programs of Buddhist grottos well beyond this one cave. However, just as prior scholars tended to go straight past the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra to other texts in their interpretation of Sengchou's meditation, they have also attempted to bypass the same text and look to other texts in their interpretation of related questions. For example, when they ask what people did in medieval caves, scholars have tended to imagine that they engaged in so-called visualization meditations of a deliberate and eidetic type thought to be propounded by contemplation sutras or guanjing. Recent work by Eric Green, however, has taught us that when meditators saw Buddhas, it is more likely that they did so in visions out of their own control, which they interpreted as diagnostic signs of their karmic state. The visions and meditation as a quest for them were also connected to repentance practices and rituals designed to expunge karmic obstacles from prior lifetimes. Green even shows that a central and distinctive motif in such meditations was contemplation of white bones. Resonances of these ideas in our cave suggest that if Sengchou, as a representative meditator, was using his cave to meditate, or if we're supposed to imagine that that was what he did, his practice, even normatively, might have been much closer to the patterns newly unearthed by Green than to controlled visualizations. The complex narrative and imagery alluded to at the cave also echoes the theme of the abandonment of the body, or shoshan, better known in English as self-immolation. Scholars like Funayama Toru and James Ben have made us well aware that this trope, and even its translation into literal practice, was an important part of Buddhism in 6th century China. Rarely, though, has this practice been linked to meditation or to the history of Proto-Chan. Yet in Sengchou's actual meditation, we see clear signs that meditation called Chan could be undertaken in relation to or preparation for such practices. This may hint at a new understanding of the ideology and assumptions that lay behind Shoshan, and a very small indication of that, which I didn't write down, is in fact that in passages very close to passages that have been studied for Shoshan practice in Daoshan's later characterization of the practice, the Vajrakaya, the Jinggangshen, is mentioned as one of the possible rewards of the practice, but that element has not been picked up by modern scholarly characterizations of the practice. This whole body of motifs may also point to various ways that we might need to pay closer attention in general to the place of the body in soteriologically oriented practices and models in the China of this time. I could say more about Sengchou's cave, believe me, and about its use of the texts to which it alludes, perhaps in the question and answer. But for now, I hope that I have at least suggested that this small cave sports a remarkably dense array of references and meanings. A satisfying interpretation of such sites, however, requires that we pay close attention to the actual texts that they refer to and to the intra- and intertextual contexts they connect to in turn. In light of such an interpretation, even this one cave can serve as a window onto unsuspected dimensions of larger questions in the history of Chinese meditation and of Buddhism even more broadly. Thank you for your attention.
Happy to take questions.
I am happy to take questions. John.
Can you say something about how the cave was used? Do you see it as a machine for meditation or as something else?
I tried to refer briefly to what I see as an underlying problem in thinking about such things, which is, I think that we don't really know. I mean, I don't know that we have any direct evidence, and we often are forced in some sense to try and infer any practice that may have taken place in the cave from the design of the cave itself. And I think that before we do that, it's useful to frame the inquiry by saying that the design of the cave is just as normative as a text is. And so we don't necessarily have any grounds for confidence in thinking that any program that we can infer from the structure of the cave was ever translated into real practice, or that things that were really done in the cave might not have been very different. So I think that we can infer to some degree that there's a sort of normative program reflected in the design of the cave. We have a number of different elements which seem to suggest, I mean, first of all, the fact that the cave is so physically small seems to mean that you wouldn't have been getting in there in a gang and doing any kind of group activity. Secondly, the fact that a number of the elements, I mean, not only do we have a meditation text written on the outside, but we have several different visual elements which are either from stories about people contemplating Buddhas, or we have images of Buddhas. And there are verses from the Avatamsaka Sutra, which I didn't get into here, which also refer to moments in the lives of past Buddhas where they were dazzled by wondrous arrays of Buddhas that were presented to them in visions and so on. And so some form of visions of Buddhas would seem to perhaps be part of it. I also tried to suggest that we might infer that we're supposed to believe that people engaged in repentance practice of some type which was connected to these vision quests in such a cave, because we have indications in the textual culture of the time and even in the exact texts that we see to referred here that those motifs were alive. But I would hesitate in translating any of that into assumptions about what people really did. And in the case of this cave, I think we're particularly in the dark because the cave itself was lost to history until 1983. However, even with other cave complexes, and I don't know as much as I should about other caves around China, I think that it's rare that we have any indication of what people really did in the caves. We just have the caves, and often the first external references to them are centuries or even a millennium later than we believe the caves themselves were made. Alexander.
I'm wondering, so these 12 practices that you laid out, they self-identify as 4 bases of mindfulness. Do they break down in 333, or how does it? I mean, you mentioned 12 points, and so I'm just wondering how that,
I don't think so. I don't think that they can be shoehorned into the name. I think the name really seems to be a misnomer. Of course, we can also examine, this is one place where a natural move is to examine the broader context in the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra, but you can read for dozens of pages on end and you don't find anything that looks like any of the other missing 3 bases of mindfulness either. So I think that somehow, but the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra itself does call this meditation Sengchou. It does say that it should be 4. And so, I mean, this presents us with 2 problems, I think. One is the compositional principles, if there were any, that lie behind the structure of the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra are a real mystery, but it could be read on one level as being full of unfulfilled intentions. It often seems to embark on a topic and then get distracted and go off in a different direction. So it's not a systematic text by any means. The second problem is that in the meditative culture of the time, when this text was known by this name, there may not have been any particular familiarity with the full-blown 4 bases of mindfulness meditation. We think that this is basic and canonical, but I don't know how many people in medieval China would have practiced it. And so the misfit between the name and the practice may not have been particularly salient.
And do they, if I just may add to this, do they have the differentiation between Adhyatmika and Bahirda? That you do it with reference to your own body and with reference to other bodies?
In this passage?
Yes, in this.
No. Yeah.
Do you think there might be any significance to the location of the cave? I think you said high up on a sheer cliff face in terms of the program that you're talking about. Might that be significant at all? And my other question is, could there be any significance to when the carvings were done? In terms of Sengchou's lifetime, I think he would have been about 70 years old based on the dates that you gave. Is that correct?
I think 80. It was 75 when carving started and then 80 when he died, and they finished up, we believe, fairly quickly after he died. Well, I don't know enough about geology to know if the cave is high up a cliff now, if that means it was high up a cliff when they made it. I think that's one factor to take into consideration. Things can change. There might have been erosion at the foot of the cliff. But I think if we presume that it was high up, it means it was inaccessible. And maybe that means, again, that it was a private place that you kind of clambered up to, and then you stayed there for a while if you'd gone to such effort. I don't know. But it also, I think, might make us ask whether anybody was ever really supposed to do anything in there at all, or whether it was created as a kind of devotional object. So the point was to generate merit from the construction of the object and not to use it in any particular way afterwards at all. I don't know. Yeah.
I have 2 points. The first is a comment, the second is a question. The comment, if you go back to the slide with the white bone meditation.
With the which white bone?
Skeleton meditation. Yeah. So this kind of meditation is still done within normative Chinese Buddhist meditation practices. And it's understood as the first stage of the 4 stages, or it can be done as a summary of the 4 stages. The others are implied in it. And this can be compressed into some of these stages here, depending on the ability of the meditator. And often this is linked to Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra and the Daichen Du Lun, rather than the Mahāparinirvāṇa-mahāsūtra. More than that we can talk about, but just to say this is not only antique, but it's a living tradition. The second is about Northern Qi. So Sengchou, as I remember vaguely, was very much honored by Northern Qi rulers. And at the time of the building of this cave, there was an enormous project across northern China, supported by the Northern Qi rulers, which funded all kinds of things, Taishan activities, caves here, caves elsewhere, all kinds of things, sculpture programs. And so my question here is, do you have a sense, number one, who paid for this cave? And number two, if it's the Northern Qi rulers, as I imagine it probably was, where does this fit within the larger program of Northern Qi sponsored activity?
Okay, so both of those are great questions. Actually, to come back to the previous question, I didn't answer what the significance might be of the moment in Sengchou's life.
If you can speak in the microphone.
Oh, sorry, yeah. I mean, he was only called to the capital in 551, and so he didn't have access to the types of resources and prestige and so on to be involved in such a project prior to that in his life. From the little that we know about his earlier life, he also seems to have been disinterested in such things. He's presented, at least again idealistically, as a recluse and somebody who is a sort of an idealist paragon of certain types of practice. So in a way, the timing, I think, just reflects opportunity. He was around. Secondly, the cave was started before he got involved, so there was some sense in which, and when I say that the donative inscription states, where was that? Oh, it was earlier. The donative inscription states that the first phase of sponsorship was undertaken by a lay association. That association was led by a person of rank. And so there is some kind of fairly direct connection with the court, and I think that we can imagine that there were probably political motives of some type behind it, but I don't know enough about the details to answer that. But then again, in relation to the connection to the moment in Sengchou's life, we might also wonder whether or not the fact that Sengchou died at the moment when the cave was being completed represented an opportunity so that the cave on the one hand could be used as a kind of monument to him, a funerary monument of some type, but secondly that his prestige could be leveraged to give a certain type of charisma to the site. In answer to your first point about the use of White Bones practice in modern Chinese contemporary Buddhism, I don't know enough about that, and I would be interested to learn about it. But you mentioned the textual sources. I did not mean to imply by any means that this is the usual source for white bones meditation or for practically anything. I think one of the interesting things about this passage is that it was so much forgotten. And I think that the timing is quite interesting. I mean, so that modern scholarship had to recover it. McRae and Undell had to do a bit of clever detective work, which other scholars weren't capable of, in order to even find the passage, especially before we had electronic search tools in a vast text. And even in the hagiography that the tradition a century later applied to Sengchou, they didn't really remember much of the details about this. They had already moved on to other concerns, and he was being borrowed as a figurehead for types of Chan practice which I suspect had developed in generations after he passed away himself. But the timing is amazing because he was a contemporary of Bodhidharma, if Bodhidharma was a real person. And so in the story of Bodhidharma as well, we have this amazing moment, and I've often wondered about this as I've been working on this material. Bodhidharma was supposed to have sat in a cave and faced the wall for 9 years, right? And I've got no idea why he is supposed to be in a cave. I don't think that sitting in caves meditating is a normal Chan school or Zen motif, but it seems to be the one point of contact between what we see here with Sengchou and something that we might regard as a more verifiable historical reality, and that fable about Bodhidharma. Otherwise, though, this is a much more concrete indication of what somebody famous was doing in the name of Chan at that point in time than anything that we know about Bodhidharma himself, I think. And that, to come back to my point, that the reason that this passage is then so interesting is precisely because it's not a well-known source of anything. And the white bones meditations that Green has studied, the loci classica for those are in a body of other texts which are to some degree much more closely associated with the Kumarajiva group. Some of the texts on meditation, the meditation manuals that Kumarajiva supposedly produced in response to requests from his disciples for instructions, which appear to be compilations of a number of different non-Chinese sources, which are paraphrased to some degree rather than translated. So the sources are really quite different, I think. And then in answer to your last question about how this fits into the overall program of Northern Zhou activity, I just don't know enough about the overall program in the Northern Zhou to really comment. The only thing is that, one thing I think is clear. As I mentioned, this is the first case in all of Chinese history where we have sutra text carved on a cave wall. So in that respect, it was an innovation, not only within the program of the Northern Qi, but within the entire tradition. And it was one which went on to be very influential. As many of you know, I guess, Professor Lothar Lederose, who is my extremely senior colleague at Heidelberg, has been engaged since 2005 in a huge project in collaboration with China, scholars in China, to study all sutra texts carved on stone in Chinese history, with the exception of the Fangshan Shijing, the Yunjusi materials. And that project has just been extended, we're pretty sure, till 2026. So by the time it's finished, it'll be one of these things that's only possible in Germany, with 21 years of continuous major funding, and it's uncovering all kinds of things. But all of that tradition that unfolded and that has then the object of that project effectively starts with a couple of minor exceptions here. And so in that respect, I think it was innovative, not only in the context of the Northern Qi, but even more generally. I'm sorry I don't know enough to answer some of your other
come to another end then. Please join me in thanking Michael.